Beach Drive. It slowed in front of Marlowe House. Something flew from the car toward the house, flying over the fence and landing on the walkway. A newspaper, he guessed. The car then continued on its way. After the vehicle drove up the street, he stepped off the sidewalk on his way to Marlowe House. He thought briefly about the newspaper, assuming that was what he had seen fly from the car, and marveled at the expert throw, yet wondered briefly if it had landed in a dry spot or in a puddle left behind from the recent rain. It really didn't matter. Alex would not have time to read the newspaper. On summer mornings, Danielle enjoyed her coffee with Walt on the back patio, but this August morning rain kept them inside, not an uncommon occurrence for Oregon. Instead of the patio, they retreated to the parlor, each bringing along a mug of hot coffee. Walt carried a plate with a cinnamon roll. Danielle had claimed she didn't want one, insisting she needed to cut back on sweets. Yet once in the parlor, she helped herself to some of Walt's cinnamon roll. He didn't object, knowing there was more in the kitchen. Plus, after last week's misadventure, he was simply grateful to be sitting in his parlor, out of the rain, and with the woman he loved. Danielle hadn't changed out of her flannel pajama bottoms and T-shirt she had worn to bed the night before, but she had taken the time to weave her dark hair into a French braid, a slight change from the fishtail braid that had once been her trademark hairstyle. Already dressed for the day in casual tan slacks and a pale blue polo shirt, Walt sat next to her on the parlor sofa. In one hand, he held his mug of coffee, and on his right knee he balanced a plate with a half-eaten cinnamon roll. "You're reading too much into this Brian and Heather thing," Danielle said, resuming the conversation she had started with Walt in the kitchen just minutes earlier. "Perhaps, but you weren't with them up on the mountain. The pair got rather cozy," Walt said before taking a sip of his coffee. "Sure they did. Goodness, poor Heather must have been terrified after waking up tied to a tree and those crazy wannabe witches. And I can't imagine how Brian is absorbing all this." "He seemed perfectly fine with it last night," Walt reminded her. "And then he goes home with Heather." He chuckled and took another sip of coffee. Danielle rolled her eyes. Why do people always say women are the gossips? Sheesh, just because Brian stopped by Heather's house on the way home from here doesn't mean he went home with her in that way. Perhaps she was just nervous about going home to a dark house. I certainly understand that, especially after being kidnapped and almost killed. Walt reached over and gave Danielle's knee a pat and said, "We will see." "Anyway," Danielle went on, snatching a pinch of Walt's cinnamon roll and popping it in her mouth, "Brian is too old for her. My dad would be about his age if he were still alive." "If you will recall, the last man Heather dated was about Brian's age," Walt reminded her. "True, but the idea of Brian Henderson and Heather Donovan in a relationship is ridiculous." "There is one way to find out," Walt said, setting his cup on the coffee table. "We could see if his car is still over there this morning." "You would really go out in this rain just to spy on our neighbor? Seriously, Walt, I am surprised at you." Walt laughed. "In case you haven't noticed, it's not raining anymore. But I'm not talking about me going outside." "I'm not going outside." "And I never suggested you should. But there is someone who was out there earlier this morning who might tell us something." Walt looked over to the windowsill where Max lounged. "Max," Walt called out. The cat looked up to Walt. Their eyes met. Danielle watched the pair in silence. After a few minutes, Walt chuckled, took a sip of coffee, and Max went back to napping. "Well?" Danielle asked after a few moments. Walt pulled off a hunk of cinnamon roll and put it in his mouth. "Well?" Danielle repeated. Walt looked to Danielle and asked, "Well, what?" "What did Max say?" "You said you weren't into gossip." Walt took a sip of coffee. Danielle groaned. "Okay, I am curious. What did Max say?" "He watched the sun come up this morning, perched in one of the trees by the garage. He had an unobstructed view into Heather's driveway."